Hi everybody! This video goes over the guidelines for the poetry analysis essay. For this first assignment for English 230, you have two options for this first essay. You can write a paper that's analyzing a single poem, or you can write a paper that analyzes an adaptation of a poem. And in this video, I'm going to go over the first of these options. So a paper that analyzes a single poem. If you're interested in the other option, there's another video that you can watch that goes over that option. So if you pick the first option, you will write a 3 to 4 page explication of a poem. As the authors of Literature, a Portable Anthology explain, this kind of paper, quote, takes what is implicit or subtle in a work of literature and makes it explicit or clear. In other words, it explains what the purpose and effect of specific words, images, figures of speech, and other literary elements. So if you choose this option, you should think of your audience as someone who has read the poem some time ago. You can assume that your reader is familiar with the poem, so they know something about it, but you should not assume that they remember it in detail, and you should not assume that the reader has the poem in front of them as they read your paper. So if there's a specific word or an image or a line of poetry that you want to talk about, you need to make sure that you're quoting that and presenting that and then explaining your points. And then the purpose of this paper is to convince your reader how a specific literary element or elements, you can talk about more than one, so this would be things like word choice, images, figures of speech, and other elements, contribute to the meaning of the poem. So making a connection between the kinds of things that we've been talking about and then the meaning. You can write on any poem on this below list. I won't read through all of them, but I will note that some of these are poems that we've talked about in class, or we will be talking about in class, and some of these are poems that we haven't talked about and that we won't be talking about. Any poem that that we haven't talked about in class that is on this list should be in your anthology, and you can find the page numbers for those poems on the sort of assignment prompt that's on Blackboard. If you do choose to pick a poem that we've already talked about, you're welcome to draw on things that you have said in your discussions. I want you to use your feel free to use your discussions as springboards for your ideas, but I do want you to also go beyond what you said in your discussion and develop your points and add detail and depth to the kinds of claims that you're making. So you can repeat points that you've made in discussion, but you shouldn't limit yourself to the points that you've made in discussion. A central part of a successful paper is a thesis. Your paper should be organized around an interpretive claim about how these elements contribute to the meaning of the poem. And that interpretive claim will basically be the central argument or the thesis of your paper. And here it gives you some examples of weak theses and stronger theses. So an example of a weak thesis, and this is about the poem Those Winter Sundays, is Those Winter Sundays includes word choice, imagery, and figures of speech. This isn't a very good thesis because it doesn't tell me, it tells me that there's these things happening, that there's word choice, imagery, and figures of speech, but it doesn't tell me why those matter or what they tell us about sort of the meaning of the poem or anything about any other claim about the poem. A stronger thesis is the claim in Those Winter Sundays, the word choice, imagery, and figures of speech show the speaker's newfound appreciation for his father's sacrifices. So the second thesis is stronger, but because it connects the literary elements, word choice, imagery, and figures of speech, to a claim about the speaker's attitude towards his father. So it connects those things to a claim about the fact that the speaker is sort of demonstrating his newfound appreciation for his father's sacrifices. Another example that I'll go through it would be a thesis about Ode to American English. So in the first thesis, it states, in Ode to American English, Barbara Hanby uses a variety of word choice, imagery, and sound patterns to show the meaning of American English. So this is maybe a little bit better than that first thesis and the last set of examples because it maybe at least uses the word meaning, but it doesn't tell me what that meaning is. It doesn't tell me in any detail what kind of meaning it's connecting these elements to. The revised thesis does. It says, in Ode to American English, Barbara Hanby uses word choice, imagery, and sound patterns to demonstrate that American English, like America itself, is vibrant because of diversity. So in the second thesis, we have a clear claim about the argument of the poem, which is that American English is vibrant because of its diversity. Before I move on, let me just also point out that in both of these theses that I've shown you that I consider to be pretty good theses, they're not talking about meanings that are really obscure or hard to uncover. The first one is about the speaker's attitude towards his father, and the second one is about the central argument of the poem. And these are probably things that you could have figured out, or conclusions that you could have come to on your own if you had read the poem a couple times and maybe talked about it with a peer. So I'm not looking for something that's really hard to uncover, or that's really sort of deep under the surface of the poem. What I'm looking is just for sort of a claim about the significance of these elements: word choice, imagery, symbolism, sound patterns, some kind of claim about their significance. And then once you have a thesis, you need to support it. So the way that you support your thesis is by presenting examples and quotations from the poem, and then explaining how that evidence supports your thesis. I like to think of body paragraphs as sort of sandwiches, where you have your claim, you present your evidence, that's sort of the meat of the sandwich, and then you have an explanation of your evidence, and that's sort of the bread. So the introduction and the explanation are the bread, and then the evidence, the quotation, or the example is the meat. And as far as sometimes I get asked about how much to talk about quotations or examples, and I think that a good general rule of thumb is that for every sentence that presents an example or quotation, you should have at least one sentence that explains it and connects it back to your thesis. So if you're going to present a really long quotation, this lots of lines of poetry, then that means you need to talk about it for lots of lines, because you don't want to assume that your reader is following your argument or is making the same kind of interpretations about the poetry that you are. You want to make your train of thought and your logic as explicit and obvious as possible for your reader. So I'll finally go over sort of the basic requirements for the paper. Like I said earlier, it should be 3 to 4 full pages. It should not be 2.5 pages. So by 3 full pages, I mean it is like the whole page is taken up. If you go over 4 full pages a little bit, that's fine. I'm not too worried about you going over. I'm much more worried about you having too few pages. Your essay should follow MLA style formatting. That means basically sort of the way the page is laid out. So that means it should be double spaced and typed in 12-point Times New Roman font. It should have 1-inch margins on each side. It should have the page number and your last name on the top right corner. And the first page should have a heading on the top left corner that has your name, your instructor's name, the class, and the date. And then your quotations should be properly formatted and documented. So this means that the lines of poetry you're quoting should be placed within parentheses. And then also, depending on how many lines of poetry you're quoting, you should also mark the line breaks of the poetry. And there's readings within your textbook that show some examples of how to do that. And then, in addition to that, the paper should be well organized. And generally speaking, this means it should have an introduction. Because this is a fairly short paper, your introduction should be short. It should briefly contextualize the poem and present your thesis. It should have several body paragraphs that develop your thesis. And each of that body paragraph should have a clear point, and all the sentences in the paragraph should explain or support that point. And then finally, it should have a short conclusion, again, probably something like 3 to 5 sentences that sums up your argument. As I say here, this paper does not require you to consult any sources aside from the poem. So I am not asking you to go out and read secondary sources or what other people have said about the poem. However, if you do decide to talk about secondary sources, you need to cite those sources, you need to document them within the paper parenthetically, and then you also need to list them on an attached works cited page. If you're only citing the poem itself, then I'm not going to expect you to attach a works cited page because a lot of these poems I'm giving you, and so it would probably be pretty hard for you to track down the citation. And then finally, I'm just going to point you to a couple resources. In pages 1263 to 1270 in your textbook, discuss poetry explication papers and provide a sample paper. So you could take a look at that, see what it looks like, and this might give you a better sense of my expectations. Pages 1254 to 1261 in your textbook discuss how to format quotations and provide some examples of that. And then finally, there's a rubric on Blackboard that will outline the grading criteria for this paper. So if you want to look at the criteria that I'll be using when I evaluate your paper, you can go to Blackboard and you can find that. Please let me know if you have any questions about this paper. Also, if you're struggling with this paper or you're struggling with a poem that you've chosen, I'm happy to set up a meeting and go through the poem with you and help you begin to sort of brainstorm ideas and even develop a tentative thesis. So let me know if you have questions or if you'd like to set up a meeting, and I look forward to your papers.